The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed twice, a heavy, hollow sound in the dead of night. 2 in the morning. Leo stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, a forgotten scotch warming in his rigid grip. Down below, the iron security gates groaned open, admitting a dented yellow cab. Out stepped his housekeeper, clutching a thin trench coat against the freezing rain. He crushed his cigarette into the crystal ashtray, the embers hissing in the dark. She was late, too late. Leo Castilian didn't wait for people. People waited for him. He ran the northern shipyards. He ran the local unions. He dictated who worked, who starved, and who quietly disappeared into the freezing, murky waters of the bay. His time was a commodity measured in thousands of dollars a minute. Yet here he was standing in the suffocating dark of his own study like a jilted teenager. The heavy oak front door clicked. The deadbolt slid back into place with a heavy thud. Soft, stockinged feet padded across the imported hardwood of the foyer. She was trying to be quiet. Leo stepped out of the study. The hallway was entirely dark, save for the ambient, sickly orange glow of the street lamps filtering through the transom window above the door. "You said it was just dinner." His voice was gravel scraping against the absolute silence of the house. Maeve jumped. Her keys slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the floorboards like dropped coins. She pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing hitching. "Jesus, Leo," she exhaled, her shoulders slumping. She was the only one who called him that. To everyone else in this city, it was Mr. Castiglione, or boss, or sir. To her, he was just the man who signed her exorbitant paychecks and couldn't figure out how to operate his own imported espresso machine. Leo stepped fully into the foyer. The dim light caught the sharp angles of his face, the perpetual dark circles under his eyes, the heavy set of his jaw, the loose tie hanging around his neck. He hadn't slept. He rarely did. "Dinner," Leo repeated. The word tasted metallic in his mouth. "You left at 7. You said you'd be back by 10. "I don't have a curfew," Maeve said. Her voice wasn't defiant, it was just tired. She bent down to retrieve her keys. As she moved, the trench coat parted, revealing a dark thrifted slip dress that had seen better days. Her hair was damp from the rain, clinging to her cheeks. She looked exhausted. The mascara under her eyes was slightly smudged, giving her a bruised, hollowed-out look. Leo's jaw tightened. "When you live under my roof, you have a curfew. If you aren't here, I have to assume someone took you." "Nobody took me, Leo. I'm a housekeeper, not a state secret." She kicked off her damp heels. They hit the baseboard with a dull thwack. "I went to a diner. I ate pie. My friend's radiator blew on the way back, and we had to wait 2 hours for a tow truck in the freezing rain. That's the grand conspiracy." Leo stared at her. He searched her face for a lie. In his world, everyone lied. Men looked him dead in the eye and swore loyalty while holding a knife behind their backs. He dissected every twitch, every micro-expression. But May was just looking at him with dull, heavy-lidded irritation. "You didn't call," he said. The anger in his voice was deflating, replaced by a cold, crawling paranoia he hated. "My phone died." May have pulled the dead, cracked piece of plastic from her pocket and held it up as evidence. "I'm sorry you were worried, I really am, but I'm too tired to be interrogated right now." She turned her back on him. The sheer audacity of it always sent a strange jolt through his chest. Men had been beaten half to death for turning their backs on Leo Castiglione. Maeve did it because she wanted a cup of tea. "I wasn't worried." Leo lied to her retreating spine. "It's a security risk." "Right. The security risk of the woman who scrubs your baseboards. Her voice drifted back from the hallway. I'm making chamomile. Do you want a cup, or are you going to stand in the dark, brooding all night? Leo stood in the foyer for a long time. His knuckles were white. He looked at the puddle her shoes had left on his pristine floors. A rational man would fire her. A ruthless man would throw her out into the rain. He unbuttoned his collar, loosened his tie, and followed her into the kitchen. The kitchen was a stark, modern cavern of stainless steel and black marble. It was a space designed for caterers, not for living. Yet when Maeve was in it, the room somehow felt smaller, warmer. She was at the stove, filling the copper kettle. The harsh overhead recessed lighting washed out her complexion, highlighting the fatigue etched around her mouth. Leo sat on one of the leather bar stools at the island, watching her. He didn't offer to help. She wouldn't have let him anyway. You smell like cheap beer, Leo noted, his voice flat. Maeve didn't turn around. She struck a match and lit the gas burner. The tow truck driver smelled like cheap beer. He was very chatty. It rubbed off. You shouldn't be riding in tow trucks at once in the morning. Would you rather I walked the 6 miles through the industrial district? I'd rather you called a godam car. Leo snapped, the irritation flaring again. Or called the house. Gianni was on shift tonight. He could have come to get you. Maeve finally turned. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. The trench coat was still on, hugging her small frame. Leo, stop. She looked at him, really looked at him. I am not one of your soldiers. I am not a package you need to secure. I'm an employee, a civilian. If I start treating your men like my personal chauffeur service, the lines get blurry. And you and I both know what happens to people when the lines get blurry in your world. He hated that she was right. She was always relentlessly, frustratingly pragmatic. It was why he had hired her. 3 years ago, she had walked into this house to clean up after a meeting that had gone terribly wrong in the basement. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't asked questions about the blood on the concrete. She had simply asked for bleach, a wire brush, and triple her hourly rate. She had crippling medical debt from a mother who had died slowly and expensively. He had a house that needed keeping and a life that required absolute discretion. It was a perfect, cynical transaction. But lately the transaction action was slipping. The kettle began to scream. Leo flinched. The shrill noise grated against his sleep-deprived nerves. Maeve turned, killed the heat, and poured the boiling water into 2 ceramic mugs. She slid one across the black marble toward him. It was a chipped mug with a faded logo of a hardware store on it. She had brought it from her own apartment because she claimed his fine china felt like drinking out of eggshells. "Drink it," she ordered softly. "It'll help you sleep. Nothing helps me sleep." "Have you tried not running a criminal empire?" she asked dryly, blowing on her tea. "It's a logistics company." Maeve let out a short, hollow laugh. "Right, and I'm Mary Poppins." She walked around the island and sat on the stool next to his. She was close enough that he could smell the damp wool of her coat, the faint scent of vanilla soap, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of the city rain. He stared down at the pale yellow liquid in his mug. "I don't like you being out there. The streets aren't safe right now. The Russians are pushing into the south side. Things are unstable." Maeve paused with her mug halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, her dark eyes entirely serious. "Leo, I live in a 4th-floor walk-up in the Narrows. I take the subway at midnight. I've been mugged twice in my life. I know how to navigate this city. The only danger I'm in is the danger of being associated with you. The truth stung, sharp and unyielding. "Then why do you stay?" he asked. It was a question he rarely allowed himself to think, let alone say out loud. Maeve stared at her tea. A heavy silence settled over the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. "The pay is good," she said finally, "and I don't have to make small talk with a corporate boss." It was a deflection. They both knew it. She had paid off her mother's medical debt 6 months ago. He had seen the final bank statement on the desk when he was looking for a pen. She didn't need this job anymore. Not really. Leo reached out. He didn't think about it. His hand just moved across the cold marble, his large, calloused fingers brushing against the sleeve of her damp coat. "Take the coat off, Maeve. You're shivering." She looked down at his hand. His knuckles were scarred, the skin rough and permanent. A violent hand, yet it rested against her sleeve with feather-like caution. Slowly she unnoted the belt of the coat and slipped it off her shoulders, draping it over the back of the stool. The slip dress beneath offered zero protection against the chill of the house. Her bare shoulders were covered in goosebumps. Lau stood up. He walked over to the digital thermostat on the wall and bumped it up 5 degrees. When he returned to his seat, she was watching him. There was a softness in her eyes that made his chest ache. It wasn't pity, it was understanding, and that terrified him more than any rival syndicate ever could. "Finish your tea," Leo muttered, staring at the wall. "Tomorrow is a long day." "They all are," she whispered. The morning light was unforgiving. It streamed through the bulletproof glass of Leo's study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Leo sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a cold cup of black coffee at his elbow. His temples throbbed with a familiar rhythmic pain. 2 hours of sleep. It was a new personal record for the week. Standing on the other side of the desk was Carmine. Carmine was a blunt instrument. He was built like a cinder block with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had caught a few too many swinging doors. He was a loyal earner running the protection rackets downtown, but he lacked finesse. "The shipment got held up at customs, boss," Carmine was saying, shifting his weight from one large foot to the other. "They're asking for double the usual tariff. Say they got a new inspector who isn't playing ball." Leo rubbed the bridge of his nose. "So find out what the inspector wants." "Everyone wants something, Carmine. Money, women, a promotion. Find his vice and squeeze it." "I could just break his legs," Carmine offered helpfully. "No." Leo sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "We are running a business, not a slaughterhouse. If you break a federal inspector's legs, they send 3 more looking for the guys who bought the baseball bats. Be smart. Buy him out." The study door clicked open. Carmine instantly went rigid, his hand dropping instinctively toward the bulge under his suit jacket. Leo just leaned back in his chair. He knew the footfalls. Maeve pushed through the heavy door. She was balancing a silver tray with a fresh pot of coffee, 2 porcelain cups, and a plate of sliced fruit. She wore her uniform, a simple, high-necked black dress with a crisp white apron. It was modest, practical, and designed to make her invisible. It failed spectacularly. "Sorry to interrupt," Maeve said, her voice entirely devoid of apology. She didn't look at Carmine. She walked straight to Leo's desk, her movements efficient and practiced. "Put it there," Leo murmured, gesturing to a clear spot on the bladder. As she leaned over to set the tray down, Carmine's eyes dropped. He didn't stare overtly. He wasn't stupid, but his gaze lingered just a second too long on the curve of her hip beneath the apron, tracking the line of her legs. It was a micro-expression, a fractional shift in a man's attention. Leo saw it. A cold, dark violence spiked in Leo's blood, so sudden and sharp it tasted like copper on his tongue. He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply shifted his eyes from Maeve to Carmine. Carmine looked back at his boss and instantly palled. The color drained from his thick neck. He recognized the look in Leo's eyes. It was the look the boss gave a man right before he became a permanent fixture in a concrete foundation. "Anything else, Carmine?" Leo asked. His voice was a whisper. It was the deadliest sound in the room. No, boss," Carmine stammered, taking a quick step back toward the door. "I'll handle the inspector today quietly." "Good. Get out." Carmine practically scrambled out of the room, shutting the heavy door behind him with a soft click. Maeve finished pouring the fresh coffee. She didn't seem to notice the near-lethal drop in the room's temperature. Or if she did, she didn't care. "You shouldn't look at him like that," she said casually, pushing the steaming cup toward Leo. "Like what?" "Like you want to unhinge your jaw and swallow him whole." Maeve picked up the empty cold mug from his desk. "He's terrified of you. He should be. He works for you, Leo. Fear only goes so far before it turns into resentment, and resentment turns into betrayal." She wiped a non-existent speck of dust off the mahogany. "That's basic management." Leo let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Where did you get your MBA, Maeve?" "The Narrows." I read, "You have a very extensive library of Sun Tzu and Machiavelli. It's light reading while I dust." Leo leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He looked up at her. In the daylight, the exhaustion from the night before was still visible around her eyes, but she carried it well. She was a woman built for endurance. He opened the top drawer of his desk. He reached past the loaded 9mm Glock, past the stacks of banded hundreds, and pulled out a small, sleek black box. He tossed it onto the desk. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right next to her hand. Maeve looked down at it. "What's this?" "Open it." She set the empty mug down and popped the lid off the box. Inside rested a brand-new top-of-the-line smartphone. Maeve frowned. She didn't touch it. "Leo, I can't take this. It's a company phone," Leo said smoothly, picking up his coffee. He took a sip. It was perfect. She always made it perfect. "Since your ancient piece of plastic can't hold a charge, you will carry this. It has a secure line. It has my direct number, Gianni's number, and the house line. I don't need a secure line to order groceries. You need it to call me when you are stuck on the side of the road at 2 in the morning," Leo countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It also has a GPS tracker." Maeve's head snapped up, her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, you heard me. I am not a dog, Leo. You don't get to microchip me. It's standard protocol for high-level staff." Leo lied smoothly. He hadn't tracked a housekeeper in his life. Maeve crossed her arms, her dusting cloth clamped tightly in her fist. "You're paranoid and you're crossing a line. I told you last night I am a civilian. You don't get to put a leash on me. I'm not putting a leash on you, Maeve. I'm putting a shield in your pocket." Leo stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, but he didn't try to intimidate her. He just looked at her with a desperate, grounded honesty. "Carmine looked at you today." Maeve blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift in topic. "What?" "When you leaned over the desk, he looked at you for a second." Leo walked around the desk, stopping a few feet in front of her. "In my world, a look is a weakness. It means he noticed you. It means he recognizes that you occupy space in this room. If Carmine noticed, other people will notice. And if someone wants to hurt me, they don't come at me with a gun in the street. They find the things in my house and they break them. Maeve stared at him, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The cynicism in her usually sharp eyes cracked, replaced by a sudden, stark understanding of the gravity of her situation. "I'm your housekeeper," she whispered, though it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. Leo reached out. He picked the phone up out of the box and pressed it gently into the palm of her hand, folding her fingers over it. "Take the phone, Maeve," he said, his voice dropping to a low, raw murmur. "Just let me know you're safe. That's all I want." She looked down at the smooth glass in her hand, then up at his face. The rigid mask of the Mafia Boss was gone, leaving only an exhausted, deeply lonely man. Slowly, she slipped the phone into the deep pocket of her apron. "If you use the tracker to see how long I spend at the grocery store," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I'll drown it in the mop bucket." A tiny, rare smile touched the corner of Leo's mouth. Fair enough. The Narrows smelled like exhaust fumes, roasting nuts, and damp cardboard. It was a neighborhood that existed in a perpetual state of rust, squeezed between the gentrified arts district and the polluted waterfront. It was loud, it was crowded, it was home. Maeve stood in the cramped aisle of Saul's Bedga, staring at a wall of overpriced canned tomatoes. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a dying wasp. It was Tuesday, her day off. Normally, Tuesdays meant doing laundry, buying cheap groceries, and sleeping until noon. Today, she couldn't focus. There was a heavy, cold weight in her jacket pocket. The phone. She hadn't turned it on. She hadn't needed to. But every time she brushed against the fabric, she felt the rigid outline of the glass and metal, a physical reminder of the man sitting in a fortress 10 minutes away. She grabbed 2 cans of crushed tomatoes and tossed them into her plastic basket. As she turned toward the deli counter, she caught her reflection in the convex security mirror tucked in the corner of the ceiling. She paused. Behind her reflection, visible through the bodega's dirty plate glass window, sat a black Lincoln Town car. It was parked illegally next to a fire hydrant. The engine was idling, puffing thin white clouds into the crisp afternoon air. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but the vehicle itself was a glaring anomaly in a neighborhood populated by rusted-out sedans and stolen bicycles. Maeve's grip on the plastic basket tightened. She walked to the register, paid S and crumpled singles, and stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The wind whipped her hair across her face, carrying the bitter chill of early November. She didn't walk toward her apartment building. Instead, she turned left, marching straight toward the idling Lincoln. She stopped beside the driver's side window and tapped hard on the glass with her knuckles. Nothing happened for 5 seconds. Then the tinted window hummed downward. Gianni sat behind the wheel. He was in his late 30s, possessing the kind of unremarkable, forgettable face that made him an excellent tail. He wore a cheap windbreaker over a very expensive suit. He didn't look embarrassed to be caught. He just looked tired. "Afternoon, Maeve," Johnny said, resting a thick forearm on the doorframe. "You forgot your change at the register." "What are you doing here, Johnny?" she asked, her voice flat. "Enjoying the cultural ambiance of the Narrows. Great empanadas down the block. Don't play stupid. You're tailing me on my day off." She leaned closer, ignoring the blast of warm air rolling out of the car's heater. "Did Leo order this? Did he tell you to sit outside my apartment like a creep?" Gianni sighed. He rubbed the stubble on his jaw, looking up and down the crowded street. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the pedestrians, the rooftops, the parked cars. The boss didn't order a tail. He ordered me to make sure you didn't get hit by a bus. There's a difference. I don't need a babysitter. I've lived here my whole life. Yeah. And before 3 years ago, you didn't know the head of the Castellian family. Johnny shot back. The casual demeanor dropped, replaced by a sudden, sharp intensity. Look, things are loud right now. The Russians are getting bold. They took out one of our warehouses in the port last night, set the whole thing on fire. The boss hasn't slept in 4 days. He's stressed, and when he gets stressed, he secures his assets. I am a housekeeper, Maeve hissed, her voice trembling with a sudden surge of adrenaline. I clean toilets. I am not an asset. You pour his coffee. You know the layout of the house. You know the security codes. Gianni leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. And you're the only person in that house who talks to him like he's a human being. The Russians don't care if your title is housekeeper or consigliere. They just look for leverage. You are leverage, Maeve. The street noise seemed to fade into a dull roar. A cold sweat broke out along her hairline. Leverage. She looked at Gianni. She looked at the heavy, dark car. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a cage. Leo hadn't just given her a phone. He had dragged her across the invisible boundary line, separating her civilian life from his violent one. I'm going home, Maeve said. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. I am going to make pasta. I am going to watch a terrible reality show. I do not want to see this car outside my window. Gianni nodded slowly. I'll park around the corner, but I'm not leaving Maeve. The boss would skin me alive. She turned and walked away, her cheap boots hitting the concrete in sharp, angry thuds. When she reached her building, she pulled the black phone out of her pocket. She stared at the blank screen for a long time. She didn't throw it in the trash. She gripped it tighter, walked up the 4 flights of stairs, and locked her deadbolt behind her. Thursday, 11:45 p.m. The estate was a tomb. The security system was armed, the massive iron gates were sealed, and the exterior floodlights bathed the manicured lawns in a harsh, clinical white light. Inside, it was completely dark. Maeve was in the basement laundry room pulling the last batch of Leo's Egyptian cotton shirts from the dryer. The rhythmic thumping of the machine was the only sound in the house. She liked the quiet. It was a reprieve from the chaotic dread that had settled in her stomach since her conversation with Gianni. The heavy oak door at the top of the basement stairs groaned open. Maeve froze. Her hands gripped a warm white shirt. She listened. Heavy, uneven footsteps moved across the foyer overhead. It wasn't the brisk, authoritative stride she was used to. This was dragging, labored. A dull thud echoed through the floorboards as if someone had heavily leaned against the wall. She dropped the shirt into the basket. She didn't call out. In this house, you didn't announce your presence to an unknown variable. You observed. She climbed the stairs quietly, keeping her weight to the edges of the wooden treads to avoid making them creak. She pushed the door open just a fraction of an inch. The hallway was pitch black, but a thin sliver of light spilled from beneath the door of the downstairs powder room. Maeve stepped into the hallway. The air smelled wrong. It took her a second to place the scent. It was sharp, metallic, and heavy. It smelled like the butcher shop in the Narrows on a hot July afternoon. Copper blood. She moved toward the powder room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her hand flat against the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. Leo was sitting on the closed lid of the toilet. His suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned, hanging off his broad shoulders, soaked in a horrifying amount of crimson. The blood was stark and vivid against the white fabric and the pristine white tile of the bathroom floor. He was pressing a folded hand towel against his left side just below his ribs. His head was tipped back against the expensive wallpaper, his eyes squeezed shut, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. His skin was the color of old parchment. "Close the door," Leo rasped. He didn't open his eyes. He just knew she was there. Maeve stepped inside and clicked the lock shut. She didn't scream. She didn't ask what happened. The pragmatic survivalist part of her brain took over, shutting down the rising panic. She walked over to the marble sink, dropped to her knees, and pulled open the heavy wooden vanity cabinet. She dragged out the massive industrial-grade first aid kit Johnny kept stocked for emergencies. It was the size of a tackle box. "Do you need a hospital?" she asked. Her voice was steady, perfectly level. Leo let out a breath that sounded like a dry cough. No hospitals. It's not deep enough to kill me. It just bleeds. Gunshot. Knife. He finally opened his eyes. They were dilated, dark, and glassy with pain. A disagreement during negotiations. Maeve popped the latches on the kits. She pulled out heavy trauma shears, gauze, a bottle of saline, and medical tape. "Move your hand," she ordered. Leo hesitated. His massive bloods slicked fingers gripped the towel tightly. "It's ugly, Maeve. I clean up after your men, Leo. I've seen ugly." She looked him dead in the eye, stripping away the difference of an employee. "Move your hand now." Slowly, agonizingly, he peeled the saturated towel away from his side. Maeve inhaled sharply through her nose. It was a nasty gash about 4 in long, slicing through the muscle of his oblique. It wasn't gushing, but it was weeping heavily, the dark blood pooling over the waistband of his slacks. She grabbed the trauma shears and cleanly cut away the ruined half of his expensive dress shirt, tossing the bloody fabric into the sink. She doused a thick pad of gauze in sterile saline. "This is going to burn," she warned him. "Do it." She pressed the soaked gauze directly into the laceration, wiping away the slick, coagulating blood to get a clear view of the damage. Leo's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural groan tore out of his throat, and his head snapped back against the wall with a hollow thud. His right hand shot out blindly, his fingers wrapping around Maeve's wrist like a vice. His grip was agonizing, capable of snapping her bones, but she didn't flinch. She just kept her eyes on the wound. "Breathe, Leo," she murmured, her voice dropping to a soft, rhythmic cadence. "Just breathe. It's clean. The cut is clean. It doesn't need stitches if we butterfly it, but you're going to have to stay off your feet." His breathing was harsh, rattling in the small tiled room. Slowly, the crushing pressure on her wrist loosened. He didn't let go, but his thumb began to stroke absent-mindedly over her pulse point. Maeve ignored the heat of his skin against hers. She worked quickly and efficiently. She flushed the wound twice more, ignoring his muffled curses. She applied liquid adhesive, pulling the edges of the jagged skin together with sterile butterfly strips, and then covered the entire area with a massive waterproof trauma dressing. When she was finished, her hands were trembling slightly, coated in a thin sheen of his blood. She sat back on her heels, leaning against the vanity. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving a cold, shaky exhaustion in its wake. Leo opened his eyes. The glassy look was fading, replaced by a deep, dark clarity. He looked down at the neat white square on his side. Then at Maeve, he looked at the blood on her hands. "You didn't ask who did it," he said quietly. "I don't want to know." Maeve reached up and pulled a clean towel from the rack. She turned on the gold faucet and began scrubbing her hands with hot water and harsh chemical soap. The water ran pink down the drain. "If I know names, I become an accessory. I like my plausible deniability. You lost your deniability. The minute you stayed in this room, the water shut off." Maeve dried her hands slowly, staring at the empty sink. The smell of copper was still thick in the air, mixing with the sharp, sterile scent of the medical soap. "Why didn't you call Gianni?" she asked, turning to face him. "He's trained for this. He's a soldier. He wouldn't have batted an eye." Leo stared at her. The harsh overhead lighting caught the gray in his dark hair, the deep lines bracketing his mouth. He looked old. He looked incredibly, profoundly tired. "Because if I called Gianni, he sees weakness," Leo said, his voice raw. "He sees a boss who let a low-level Russian enforcer get within striking distance with a blade. In my world, weakness is blood in the water. If my men think I'm slipping, they start looking for a new shark to follow." He leaned forward slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his side. He rested his elbows on his knees, hanging his head. "I came here," Leo whispered to the floor tiles, "because you're the only person in this city who doesn't want anything from me." The vulnerability of the confession hit her like a physical blow. It was a terrifying thing to witness. The apex predator of the city's underworld, stripped of his armor, sitting on a toilet lid and admitting his absolute isolation. Maeve stepped forward. She didn't think about the boundaries. She didn't think about the rules. She reached down and placed her hand on the back of his neck. His skin was cold and clammy with shock. Leo went completely still. Then slowly he leaned into her touch. "Can you walk?" she asked softly. "I think so." "Good. You're going to bed and tomorrow you're staying there. I have meetings. Cancel them," Maeve snapped, the housekeeper returning to her tone. "Or I'll call Gianni and tell him you slipped in the shower like an old man." A low, raspy chuckle vibrated in Leo's chest. It ended in a "Ws. You're a ruthless woman, Maeve. Somebody has to be." The next evening, the rain returned. It beat relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the kitchen, distorting the city skyline into a blur of smeared neon. Leo was not in bed. He was sitting at the kitchen island. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a dark, loose t-shirt that hid the bandages on his torso. The casual clothing made him look strangely larger, stripping away the structured camouflage of his tailored suits. He looked like an athlete in recovery, bruised but heavily coiled. He had a sleek black laptop open in front of him, scrolling through columns of numbers with a grim expression. Maeve walked into the kitchen carrying an armful of cleaning supplies. She stopped when she saw him. "I thought I told you to stay upstairs," she said, dumping a bottle of glass cleaner onto the counter with a loud thud. "I get claustrophobic." Leo didn't look up from his screen. Besides, the stairs are a tactical nightmare with a torn oblique. Maeve rolled her eyes, walking over to the sink to wet a sponge. "You're impossible. I'm hungry." She paused, turning the faucet off. She looked at him. He hadn't eaten since the incident. She had brought a tray of toast and broth to his door that morning, but it had remained untouched in the hallway. "I can heat up the leftover chicken from Tuesday," she offered. "No." Leo finally closed his laptop with a sharp click. He pushed it away and looked at her. "I ordered food. It should be at the security gate in 5 minutes." Maeve frowned. "You ordered food? Gianni isn't on shift. The gate guards don't let delivery drivers up the drive. They will tonight. I cleared it." He watched her closely. "I ordered enough for 2. Maeve froze, the wet sponge dripping slowly onto the marble. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt very thick. "Leo," she started, her voice cautious. "I have baseboards to scrub in the East Wing. The baseboards are immaculate. You cleaned them on Monday. I checked." He shifted his weight on the stool, stifling a grimace. "Sit down, Maeve. It wasn't an order from a boss. It was a request from a man that made it infinitely harder to refuse." 10 minutes later, the iron gates buzzed and a terrified teenager in a soaked windbreaker practically sprinted to the front door, dumped 3 brown paper bags on the porch and peeled out of the driveway. Maeve carried the bags into the kitchen. The smell of garlic, soy sauce, and fried oil immediately filled the sterile space. She began unpacking the white cardboard cartons, lining them up on the pristine black marble. Dumplings, lo mein, General Tso's chicken, beef, and broccoli. It was a feast of cheap, salty comfort food. She went to grab the expensive silver cutlery from the drawer, but Leo stopped her. "Use the chopsticks," he said, pulling 2 wooden sets from the bottom of the bag. "Silver ruins the taste." Maeve hesitated, then took the cheap wooden sticks. She sat on the stool next to him, the same stool she had sat on 3 nights ago when he had interrogated her about her whereabouts. They ate in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the rain lashing against the glass and the scraping of chopsticks against cardboard. It was surreal. The head of a violent syndicate and his housekeeper eating cheap takeout in a kitchen worth more than a city block. "You were right," Leo said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. He didn't look at her. He stared at a dumpling pinched between his chopsticks. "About what, Carmine?" Leo set the dumpling down. "So he talked to a rival crew, tried to sell the transit routes. He thought I was distracted." Maeve stopped chewing. A cold dread settled over her chest. What happened to him? Leo finally turned to look at her. His eyes were flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the face of the monster she tried so hard to forget he was. "He won't be working for us anymore. He's relocated." Relocated. The word tasted like ash in the air. "You killed him," she whispered. "I handled a threat to my business and my household," Leo corrected smoothly, though his jaw ticked. "He was a liability. He was a man, and you executed him because he looked at me too long. I eliminated him because he was a traitor." Leo's voice dropped an octave, a dangerous rumble vibrating in the space between them. "The fact that he noticed you just expedited the timeline. I don't take chances with things that belong in my house." Maeve dropped her chopsticks. They clattered loudly against the counter. She pushed away from the island, standing up. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mix of furious anger and terrifying realization. "I don't belong to you," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I am an employee. I clean your house. I patch you up when your violent life bleeds onto my clean floors. But I am not property. I am not a prize you protect by murdering people." Leo stood up. It was a fluid, sudden movement, completely ignoring the tearing pain in his side. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, backing her up against the edge of the counter. He didn't touch her, but he didn't have to. His sheer physical presence, the radiating heat of his body, the absolute predatory focus in his eyes, it trapped her just the same. "You think this is a transaction?" Leo asked. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the mint of his toothpaste, the faint metallic scent of the blood still lingering on his skin. "You think you can just walk in here, scrub the blood off my hands, look at me like I'm a human being, and then go back to your apartment in the Narrows like nothing happened? That's exactly what I do," she shot back, refusing to break eye contact, even as her pulse roared in her ears. "You're lying to yourself." Leo's voice was a ragged whisper. He brought a hand up, resting it on the marble counter right beside her hip, effectively caging her in. "You don't stay here for the money. You paid off your mother's debt months ago. You stay because you see exactly what I am, the monster in the dark, and you aren't afraid of me. I'm terrified of you." Maeve breathed. "No." He leaned in closer. His nose brushed against the shell of her ear. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "You're terrified of the fact that you want to stay." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The space between them was charged heavy with 3 years of unspoken tension, of stolen glances of late-night tea and quiet, bloody secrets. He raised his hand. His knuckles brushed against her cheek. It was a ghost of a touch, impossibly gentle for a man who had just admitted to murder. Maeve's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. For a terrifying, endless second, the boundary line between the mob boss and the maid completely vanished, leaving only a man bleeding out in the dark and the woman holding the bandages. Then the shrill, jarring ring of the secure phone in Leo's pocket shattered the silence. Leo froze, his jaw locked. He slowly dropped his hand, the iron mask of the boss sliding back into place, cold and impenetrable. He took a step back, pulling the phone from his pocket. Gianni Leo barked into the receiver, turning his back on her. "What is it?" Maeve leaned back against the counter, her legs suddenly weak. She pressed a hand to her burning cheek, staring at his broad back as he issued quiet, lethal orders into the phone. The line was drawn again, but they both knew it was written in chalk, and the rain was already washing it away. Leo ended the call. He didn't put the phone back in his pocket. He just held it, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. The air in the kitchen had completely changed. The heavy charged intimacy of the last 5 minutes evaporated, replaced by the cold, sterile reality of a war room. "Pack a bag," Leo said. He didn't look at her. He was already walking toward the study, his hand pressing against his bandaged side. Maeve stood frozen by the island. "What?" "5 minutes." Maeve. "Oh, essentials only." Yanni is pulling the SUV around to the garage. She pushed away from the counter, following him down the hallway. "Leo, stop. What is going on?" He shoved the heavy oak door of the study open. He moved behind his desk, yanked the bottom drawer open, and pulled out a matte black steel lock box. He keyed in a code. The lid popped open, revealing 2 heavy automatic weapons and stacks of bundled cash. "Sukov's men just hit the downtown club," Leo said flatly, pulling a loaded magazine from the box and slapping it into the grip of a handgun. "They didn't just shoot the place up, they firebombed it. 3 of my men are dead. They're making a play for the city, and they are sweeping the board." Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. The reality of his words hit her like cold water. She had spent 3 years floating on the periphery of his violence, cleaning up the aftermath, pretending the bloodshed was just a stain on a rug. Now the violence was at the front door. "I'm going to my apartment," she said, her voice tight. "I'll take the subway. They don't know who I am." Leo slammed the slide back on the gun. A bullet chambered with a sharp metallic crack. "Gianni found 2 spotters parked outside your building an hour ago." Leo looked up, his eyes entirely black. They know exactly who you are. They know you buy your groceries at S's bodega. They know you take your tea with honey. You are on the board, Maeve, and if you go back to the Narrows tonight, you will be dead before sunrise. The breath rushed out of her lungs. She gripped the doorframe to keep her knees from buckling. "You did this," she whispered, a sudden white-hot anger piercing through the terror. "You put me on the board. I know." He didn't offer excuses. He didn't apologize. He just pulled a smaller, compact 9mm from the box, checked the safety, and walked around the desk. He held it out to her, grip first. Maeve stared at the dark metal. "I don't know how to shoot." "You point it at the center of their chest, and you pull the trigger until it stops clicking," Leo said harshly. He grabbed her hand, forcing the cold grip into her palm, wrapping her trembling fingers around it. "Keep the safety on until you need it. It's the lever on the left." "I am not a killer, Leo. Neither was I once." He stepped closer, his massive hands cupped her face, his thumbs pressing into her cheekbones. His grip was entirely desperate. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let them touch you, but you have to listen to me. No arguments, no pride. You do exactly what I say." A heavy pounding echoed from the foyer. Leo dropped his hands, spinning toward the sound, his weapon raised. "Boss, it's me." Gianni's voice filtered through the heavy oak of the front doors. Leo lowered the gun, moving to the foyer. He killed the deadbolt and yanked the door open. Gianni practically fell inside, rain slicking his hair to his skull. His expensive suit was ruined, plastered to his chest. He was bleeding from a shallow cut above his eye. "The gate is compromised," Johnny gasped, wiping the blood from his vision. "They bypassed the electronic lock. We have maybe 3 vehicles coming up the private drive, heavily armed." Leo didn't blink. The panic that had been bleeding out of him just moments ago vanished, replaced by an icy, terrifying calm. He was in his element. He was the apex predator, cornered in his own den. "Lock down the perimeter," Leo ordered. "Drop the steel shutters on the ground floor. Nobody gets in. Boss, there's at least 20 of them. We have 6 men on the property, then 6 men will have to do." Leo turned back to Maeve. She was standing in the hallway, clutching the heavy gun against her chest like a shield. The basement now. The wine cellar was a climate-controlled vault buried beneath the foundation of the house. It was a labyrinth of mahogany racks holding thousands of bottles of imported vintages. It was also designed as a panic room encased in reinforced concrete, with a heavy steel door that locked from the inside. Maeve sat on a wooden crate of Pinot Noir in the absolute dark. The power to the estate had been cut 20 minutes ago. The emergency generators had kicked in, but Leo had ordered the basement circuits killed to blind anyone who made it downstairs. The air was frigid. She was shivering, though she couldn't tell if it was from the temperature or the adrenaline vibrating in her bones. The silence was the worst part. Above her, muffled by layers of concrete and hard wood, she could feel the dull, rhythmic thuds of the assault. It didn't sound like movies. There was no continuous roar of automatic fire. It was sporadic. A heavy singular crack, a pause, then 3 more. The horrific sound of shattering glass, the sickening crunch of splintering wood. Every noise made her stomach pitch. She kept picturing Leo, his side ripped open, bleeding out on the pristine marble of the foyer. Clang! Maeve's head snapped up. The sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the narrow ventilation shaft near the ceiling of the cellar. The heavy steel grate rattled. Someone was trying to pry it open from the outside. They hadn't breached the heavy steel door. They had found the air intake on the side of the house. She stood up, her boots entirely silent on the stone floor. She gripped the 9mm. Her palms were sweating so heavily she was terrified the weapon would slip from her grasp. Creak! The heavy metal grate gave way, crashing onto the stone floor, or a few feet away with a deafening noise. A beam of harsh white light cut through the pitch-black cellar, a tactical flashlight clear. A thick, accented voice grunted. A heavy pair of boots dropped through the opening. The man hit the ground hard, his flashlight sweeping the dark aisles of wine racks. Maeve backed up, pressing her spine against the cold concrete wall. She raised the gun. Her hands were shaking violently. Pointed at the center of their chest, she thumbed the safety off. It made a tiny click. The flashlight beam snapped directly onto her face, blinding her instantly. "Found the girl!" the man called out over his shoulder. He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He began walking toward her, his heavy footsteps echoing in the vault. Maeve squeezed the trigger. The recoil was massive. The gun kicked violently in her hands, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet shattered a row of expensive Bordeaux 3FT to the man's left, raining glass and dark red liquid across the floor. She missed. The man cursed, raising his own weapon. Maeve didn't try to shoot again. Pragmatism overrode panic. She dropped the gun, grabbed a heavy, unopened Magnum bottle of champagne from the rack beside her, and hurled it with all her strength directly at the flashlight beam. The heavy glass bottle connected with a sickening crunch. The man roared in pain. The flashlight dropped, spinning wildly on the stone floor, casting erratic, strobing shadows across the cellar. Maeve lunged forward. She didn't run toward the door. She ran toward the small utility closet tucked in the corner of the cellar, the place where she kept the cleaning supplies for the basement level. She yanked the door open. Her hand blindly searched the metal shelf. Her fingers curled around the heavy, industrial-grade plastic jug. Concentrated bleach. Undiluted, the man recovered. He was cursing in Russian, stepping over the shattered glass, his gun raised, sweeping the strobing shadows. "I'm going to blow your kneecaps off," he snarled. Maeve unscrewed the cap of the bleach. She took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the rack, and threw the entire gallon jug at him. It didn't hit him perfectly, but it didn't have to. The heavy plastic cracked as it clipped his shoulder, splashing a massive wave of the caustic, burning chemical directly across the right side of his face and chest. The man dropped his gun. He let out a shrieking, animalistic scream, clawing at his eyes as the chemical burned into his skin. He stumbled backward, crashing into a rack, bringing hundreds of bottles down in an avalanche of glass and wine. Maeve backed away, pressing her hands over her mouth to keep from vomiting. The smell of the bleach was overpowering, mixing with the sharp scent of alcohol and the copper tang of blood. Before the man could recover, the heavy steel door of the cellar groaned, screaming on its hinges as the electronic lock was bypassed from the outside. The door swung open. Leo stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim emergency lights of the hallway. He looked like a nightmare. His gray sweatpants were soaked with fresh blood from his torn stitches. His face was smeared with soot and dirt, and his eyes were hollow, empty voids of absolute violence. He took one look at the Russian writhing on the floor. He didn't ask questions. He raised his weapon and put a single deafening round into the man's head. The screaming stopped. The silence came crashing back, heavy and absolute. Leo lowered the gun. He looked at the shattered glass, the spilled wine, the caustic smell of bleach burning his nose. Finally, his eyes found Maeve. She was pressed against the far wall, shaking uncontrollably, her arm wrapped tightly around her stomach. He dropped his gun. It clattered loudly on the stone. He crossed the room, ignoring the glass, crunching beneath his boots, and pulled her into his chest. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her damp hair. He was shaking just as badly as she was. "I've got you," he rasped, his voice tearing at the seams. "You're safe. I've got you." Maeve buried her face in his shoulder. She didn't cry. The shock was too deep, too freezing. She just held on to him, her hands gripping the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. She anchored herself to the monster because he was the only thing keeping her alive in the dark. Dawn broke over the estate like a bruised eye. The sky was a pale, sickly violet, illuminating the wreckage. The front doors were completely gone, splintered off their heavy hinges. The pristine white marble of the foyer was scored with bullet holes and stained with large, dark patches of dried blood. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a graveyard. Maeve stood at the kitchen sink. The water was running hot, scalding her skin. She was scrubbing her hands with the rough side of a sponge. They were clean, but she couldn't stop scrubbing. The phantom sensation of the bleach jug, the terrifying recoil of the gun, the wet sound of Leo's final shot, it was glued to her skin. A heavy, dragging footstep sounded behind her. She turned the water off. She didn't turn around. Leo walked into the kitchen. He had changed his clothes. He wore a clean black shirt and dark slacks, but the exhaustion radiating off him was terminal. He moved like a man 30 years older. He stopped a few feet away from her. "Sock is dead," Leo said. His voice was hollow, devoid of triumph. "Gianni and the surviving boys hit his compound an hour ago. The Russians are fractured. They're retreating. The city is quiet." Maeve stared out the bulletproof glass window. The manicured lawn was torn up by heavy tires. "How many of your men?" she asked quietly. "4." She nodded slowly. She finally turned to look at him. He looked wrecked. The invincible Mafia Boss was gone, leaving only a brutalized man standing in the ruins of his own making. Leo reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and set it on the black marble island. He slid it across the counter. It stopped a few inches from her hand. Maeve looked at the envelope. "What is this?" 200,000 in cash, a passport with a new name, a one-way ticket to Geneva. Leo wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor. "Gianni has a car idling in the back. He'll take you to a private airstrip in Jersey. You'll be in Switzerland by tonight." Maeve stared at the brown paper, the escape hatch, the fairy tale ending where the dangerous man pushes the innocent woman away to protect her. It was noble. It was tragic. It pissed her off. "You're firing me," she said, her voice dangerously calm. Leo flinched. He finally looked up, his eyes tortured. "I am trying to save your life, Maeve. Look around you. Look at this house. Look at what you had to do in that cellar. I dragged you into a war. I turned you into a target. I threw a gallon of industrial bleach into a man's face to survive." She shot back, stepping away from the sink. She walked over to the island, stopping right in front of him. "I didn't do it because I was a victim. I did it because I refused to die in a basement. "You didn't break me, Leo. If you stay, you will never be clean again," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Every day will be a risk. Every time the door knocks, every time a car idles too long, you will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. I can't do that to you. You don't get to make my choices for me." Maeve picked up the heavy manila envelope. She held it for a second, feeling the weight of a safe, quiet, entirely lonely life in Europe. She looked at Leo. She saw the blood on his collar. She saw the ruthless violence he was capable of. She saw the man who had sat on a toilet lid, completely terrified of his own isolation. She saw exactly what he was without any illusions. She tossed the envelope over her shoulder. It landed in the stainless steel trash can with a dull thud. Leo stared at the trash can, then back at her. Absolute disbelief, wearing with a desperate, suffocating hope. "Are you insane?" he whispered. "Probably," Maeve said. She stepped into his space. She didn't hesitate. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, and pulled him down to her level. "Who is going to clean this house, Leo?" she murmured, her lips brushing against his jaw. "Your men don't know how to dilute the floor cleaner. They'll ruin the hardwood." A harsh, ragged breath tore out of Leo's chest. The last of his resistance shattered. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, holding her with a crushing, desperate strength, as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was raw, bruising, and deeply desperate. It tasted like adrenaline, copper, and profound survival. It was a promise made in the dark, signed in blood, and sealed in the wreckage of a violent life. They were both ruined. They were both trapped. But as Maeve held the monster in the ruins of his castle, she knew she wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Did this gritty, grounded mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Abe outsmart a hitman with industrial bleach instead of playing the helpless victim, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who loves their romance dark, cynical, and ruthlessly realistic. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another intense, pulse-pounding original story. What was your favorite moment? Drop a comment below and let me know. Stay safe, stay sharp, and see you in the next video.